An estimated 3 million people in the United States have celiac disease. In people with celiac disease, foods that contain gluten trigger the production of antibodies that attack and damage the lining of the small intestine. This kind of damage impairs the ability of celiac disease patients to absorb nutrients and puts them at risk for other very serious health problems, including osteoporosis, growth retardation, and even intestinal cancers. There is no cure for celiac disease, and the only way to control it is to avoid consumption of gluten entirely. Gluten is a protein that occurs naturally in wheat, rye, barley, and crossbreeds of these grains. Foods that typically contain gluten include breads, cakes, cereals, and pastas. Gluten gives breads and other grain products their shape, strength, and texture. In 2004, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act was enacted by Congress. This law covers all packaged foods regulated under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It also identified 8 foods or food groups as major food allergens and requires declaration of these allergens on the food label in the manner described by law. This law also directed the Secretary of Health and Human Services to define and permit the use of the term gluten-free in the labeling of foods. In August 2013, the FDA issued a final rule defining the term gluten-free for voluntary use in the labeling of foods. The compliance date for the final rule was a year later in August 2014. Food products bearing a gluten-free claim that are labeled on or after that date need to meet the rule's requirements. This rule was intended to help consumers, especially those living with celiac disease, to be confident that items labeled gluten-free met a defined standard for gluten content. This was done by ensuring that consumers with celiac disease were provided with truthful, accurate, and not misleading labeling information to better assist them in identifying foods they can consume when following a gluten-free diet. The FDA also hoped that this rule would benefit the food industry by establishing a level playing field among food manufacturers of products labeled gluten-free. The gluten-free final rule says that foods may be labeled gluten-free if they meet the definition and otherwise comply with the final rule's requirements. The final rule defines gluten-free as a food that is inherently gluten-free or does not contain an ingredient that is a gluten-containing grain, an ingredient that is derived from a gluten-containing grain that has not been processed to remove gluten, or an ingredient that is derived from a gluten-containing grain and that has been processed to remove gluten if the use of that ingredient results in the presence of 20 parts per million or more gluten in the food. Any unavoidable presence of gluten in the food must be below 20 parts per million of gluten. At the time of the final rule, challenges regarding the testing of hydrolyzed and fermented foods became apparent. A lack of scientifically valid testing methods for fermented and hydrolyzed foods caused the FDA to issue a proposed rule to provide alternative means for the agency to verify compliance of fermented or hydrolyzed foods based on records that are made and kept by the manufacturer. Just as with all other foods, these foods still have to meet the definition of gluten-free. Besides meeting the requirements of the gluten-free final rule, manufacturers wanting to make a gluten-free claim would have to demonstrate through their records that their products contain less than 20 parts per million intact gluten before fermentation or hydrolysis, and that no gluten was introduced during the fermentation or hydrolysis process or during manufacturing due to cross-contact. These records must provide adequate assurance that the food or its ingredients comply with the gluten-free rule before fermentation or hydrolysis. The manufacturers must also ensure that any amount of gluten that may be present in the food from cross-contact is less than 20 parts per million. Under the gluten-free labeling rule, manufacturers would have to keep records for at least 2 years after the food enters interstate commerce and provide those records to the FDA upon request during an inspection. FDA enforces gluten-free labeling requirements related to hydrolyzed or fermented foods by reviewing labels, conducting on-site inspections of food manufacturers, and reviewing manufacturing records. In early 2016, FDA released the results of a sampling assignment in which 702 samples from more than 250 products labeled gluten-free were analyzed. Only one of those products did not comply with the FDA labeling requirements. That product was recalled, and subsequent sampling did not find any products that violated gluten-free regulations. In October 2015, the FDA began to get a number of consumer complaints regarding General Mills Cheerios. The FDA immediately notified General Mills, and they conducted a recall of their products. Cheerios products had been exposed to wheat cross-contact due to the use of unwashed trucks that were previously used to transport wheat. General Mills explained that typically their trains run directly into the production facility, but due to a track problem, they decided to use trucks, and these were not checked for possible gluten cross-contact. Once General Mills found out about the problem, they issued their recall right away and went into immediate action to fix the issue. Since then, they have put in place technology to avoid this occurring in the future. The Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act applies to packaged foods, including those served at fast food restaurants and retail outlets. The gluten-free labeling rule establishes a federal definition of the term gluten-free for food manufacturers. This definition was intended to provide a reliable way for people with celiac disease to avoid gluten. Restaurants' use of gluten-free labeling should be consistent with the federal definition. State and local governments play an important role in oversight of restaurants. The FDA continues to work with state and local government partners with respect to gluten-free labeling in restaurants. When evaluating foods for purchase, the FDA recommends that consumers not only search for gluten-free claims, but also review the ingredient statement. If there is a wheat ingredient or a contains wheat statement on a product that is labeled gluten-free, it should be accompanied by a clarifying statement. Consumers who become ill or otherwise experience adverse health effects that they believe to be associated with having eaten a particular food, or those who notice mislabeled products, can report any complaint to an FDA Consumer Complaint Coordinator in the state where the food was purchased. The phone numbers of the respective states can be found through the link on this slide. Consumers may also contact MedWatch, FDA's Safety Information and Adverse Event Reporting Program.